This is part 2 of part 1 of verses 9 through 14. Let's pray and then we'll dive in. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your spirit. I just ask that over the next few minutes you would teach us, open our hearts, open our minds, open our ears. Maybe be receptive to what your word has to teach us, so that we might walk in a manner worthy of you, that's pleasing to you, and do it in a way that gives you great glory. So in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want us to fly through what we did last week, and then we'll spend about 15 minutes on this week. So let's back up to 2 weeks ago, just sort of give you some context of where we've been. The first week in this series, we looked at verses 1 through 8, and we essentially said 5 things. First, God's will for your life is not a mystery. He's made it pretty clear what His will is for all of us. So the wrong question is, what is God's will for my life? Because you were not ultimate. The right question is, what is God's will? The second thing we said from verse 4 is you cannot love Jesus and hate the church. And so we have this sort of movement going on where people are saying, well, I'll love Jesus, but I don't want to go to church. I don't want to be around Christians. They're hypocrites. They're rude. They're arrogant. So that kind of stuff. What the Bible says is that's ludicrous. The third thing we looked at is where is our hope? And Paul says their love, the Colossians' love for other saints, was not based on their hope in this life. That your hope, it cannot be in this life, because this life is going to end. And it's foolish to put your hope in something that won't last. The fourth thing we looked at, when the gospel really takes root in your heart, it always bears fruit. And then the fifth thing was the whole message of the gospel is a message of grace. Okay, from there, Paul goes into verses 9 through 14. We looked at verse 9, really the first part of verse 10 last week, so I'll just recap that. I think I have that up here. Here's the passage, so let's read it, and then I'll recap what we did last week, and then we'll move into the last part of verse 10. Here's what Paul says, Colossians 1, starting in verse 9. We'll read the whole thing, just to sort of give you an idea of the passage as a whole. Okay, and so from the day we heard, that's Paul and Timothy, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you will be filled with the knowledge of His will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Here's our phrase. So as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. May you be strengthened with all power, according to His glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, forgiveness of sins. Okay, so next week we'll unpack 11 through 14. All I want to do this week is just finish out verse 10. So let's recap what we did last week, and then we'll move into this week. We said, essentially, if you're going to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, you got to do 2 things. There are 2 requirements. The first is this: you need to be obedient to God's will. Okay, that just raises the question. Okay, what is God's will? Like it'd be foolish for me to say to Riley Grace, "Do what I say." Okay, and she'd be like, "Well, what did you say?" So, and the whole point of this is God's will is not a secret. It's not some sort of, well, I've kept it from you, and so it's going to be something that I'm going to be mad at you about, even though I didn't tell you what I wanted you to do. He's been pretty clear. Matthew 27, verses 37 and 39. We looked at this. What is God's will? You to love God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your mind. Like, that's pretty clear. And then Jesus goes one step further and says, also, it can't just be that. Also, you got to love others. So then we get worked up into this thing where, what is God's will for my life? Do I go to college? Do I get a job? Who do I marry? When do I marry? How many kids should I have? Should I have kids? And so we just lose our minds about this. And God's whole point is, hey, whatever. I mean, there's specific things He'll guide you to do. But overall, I mean, don't get worked up about that. Just love God with all your heart, with all your mind. And then love other people. And then you're free to do whatever. I mean, don't do sinful things. But don't get so anxious about stuff that you just sort of just come to a halt in your walk with Christ and you just don't do anything. So that's God's will for your life. It's not a secret. It is your sanctification. So this is one of the things that I love about 1 Thessalonians and about the Bible as a whole. It's not as if God has said, and this is what these mystery cults and religions were saying. We talked about this last week. Like in Colossae, where the church is, there are these mystery cults who they think they have some sort of special knowledge. And so if you join our group, we'll give you that knowledge. And what Paul's saying is, our God is not like that. Like, He's told you what He wants you to do. He's told you all that you need to know. He's told you His will. It's clear as day in 1 Thessalonians. This is the will of God. Your sanctification. Like, you growing more and more in love with Christ. Like, that's His will. So, you got to be obedient to that. The second thing is applying God's wisdom. So we talked about this, where so often in the Scriptures, wisdom equals righteousness. So it kind of sounds weird to say apply wisdom. I thought wisdom was just knowing a lot. Well, what the Scriptures would say, wisdom is more than just knowledge applied. Like, if that knowledge doesn't lead you into looking more like Christ, then that's a cheap wisdom that we don't want any part of. So I talked about this, where righteousness doesn't just happen. Like, you don't just ooze into being more godly. So Jacqueline's been gone this weekend. Her sister had twins. And it was sort of ironic because I used that graphic illustration last week. That sometimes I don't. Oftentimes I get away from this and I don't need to do that because that leads me into illustrations that involve C-sections. And so I used that illustration, and then I found out on Friday that she was having a C-section. So I was like, oh, okay, that was God's will then, clearly. And so she had twins. Long story short, we were at the hospital. She needed help because she already has 3 kids. So Jacqueline's going to stay with her in Baton Rouge this weekend. So I was all alone, fending for myself. And so it's crazy once you get married because for 21 years, 22 years, I could do my thing. Like I knew how to, especially when I got in teenage years, went to college, I could cook for myself, wash my own clothes, dress myself, brush my teeth, that kind of thing. But like now, once I have a wife, I've grown so dependent on her that like I forget, should I wear clothes today? Like, how do I brush my teeth? Can I cook anything? How does this thing work with 4 things on the top of it? And so I went to Panera Bread because I didn't feel like cooking, didn't know what to cook, forgot how to cook. So I went to Panera Bread and I got what I always get, a soup and a bread bowl, which is evidence that God exists. And so, but here's what I know: that bread bowl, that delicious soup and that bread bowl didn't just pop out of nowhere. Like somebody had to be back in the kitchen, fixing that thing, pouring in the soup. So in the same way, righteous, you just don't wake up righteous. Like you've got to really fight the sin in your life, and you've got to really be hungry for godliness. And the same thing is true with running. Like if I were to do couch to 5K, for me that would be couch to the casket, because essentially I don't run. Like I don't do that kind of stuff. So it'd be foolish for me to think I'm going to get up off the couch after not having ever run. I'm going to run 3 miles. And survive it. So the whole point is this: you can't just wake up and be righteous. Like you've got to be ferocious in this thing. Okay, so that gets us into this week. What happens? Like what happens when Paul says, "Okay, I want you to be obedient to God's will, and I want you to apply His wisdom." Okay, so what happens once that becomes a reality in your life? What happens when you walk in a manner worthy of the Lord? Like, what are the results of that? So we saw 2 requirements. Now we're going to look at 2 results. Here's the first one. You're walking in a manner worthy of the Lord. Your actions will increasingly demonstrate the character of God. That's hard. Where am I getting at? Look at verse 10. Paul says, to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. All that means is, he tells you, right, the next phrase, fully pleasing to Him. A life that's worthy of the Lord is a life that pleases the Lord. Okay, so what is this whole actions thing? Here's what he says. When you're walking in a manner worthy of the Lord, you're bearing fruit. This is what he said above in verse 6. And every good, okay, what's that word? Bearing fruit in every good what? Every good work. Okay, now here's what I know. You'll downshift into being a Pharisee and think, okay, work equals religious activity. Okay, so if what you think Paul just said is a life that's worthy of the Lord is one that does more religious stuff, you've missed the whole point of the 10 verses of this chapter. Paul's not saying to live in a manner worthy of the Lord, you need more religious activities. You need an extra worship service, one more conference, another chapter of the Bible in the morning, a few more minutes in prayer. Like, if that's what you hear, that's what you understand by a word, then we've got to do some work to get you out of that. Here's Paul's whole point. When the gospel really takes root, and the knowledge of all God's done for you, and the wisdom, you're applying it to pursuing godliness, when that really becomes a reality in your life, then it shows in your actions and your deeds and what you do. That's what he means by work. Not coming up, showing up to church every time the doors are open and doing all this religious stuff. But what he means by work is it's just what you do, your actions. So here's a difficult question. You think back to when Christ saved you, whether you were 7 or 17 or 47 or 67, when Christ saved you, and all that you desired and once knew and once did was just changed. Doesn't mean you didn't still struggle with it, but there was a fundamental change in what you thought and how you acted. Like, can you say now, after however long you've been walking with Christ, that there is any difference in your actions? Like, when people think about you and how you interact with them and how you do things, like, do they think, that really reflects God's character? Like, that really is gracious, that's loving, that's humble, that's merciful. So is there any difference in how you treat your family? Like, is there any difference in how you treat your friends, and your coworkers, and your classmates? Like, is there any difference in how you treat your server at the restaurant? Like, I served for a bit at Chili's. I'll never do that again. But one of the things I realized is this. Some people who walk, they got the WWJD bracelet on their wrist, or some sort of cross on their, which is an instrument of torture, on their neck. Like, they were the most rude, most cheap. I mean, as a Christian, I hated to serve Christians who claim to be Christians, because they were the worst type of people to serve. They're rude to you, not gracious, very demanding. I'm thinking, is there anything in you right now that shows Christ? Like, I can't see it, and if I can't see it, and I'm looking for it, people who aren't looking for it certainly aren't going to see it. So, is there anything about how you treat your server? Here's one for me that's difficult. Is there anything different about how you conduct yourself on the highway? Like, okay, I'll be completely honest with you. One of the areas of my life where I am prone to take myself off the cross and just downshift into evil is when I'm driving in New Orleans, which is where I live. Okay, now it's just a weakness. I'm just telling you that. But in my defense, some of it's justified because statistically, New Orleans is the state with the worst drivers on the planet. Like, are you getting that? So some of it's justified, but there are times when I'm driving down 610 or I-10 and it just sort of cuts me off, right? And before it was just me, and so I could sort of, Father, forgive me. And so, but now, then I had Jacqueline. She was like, "Whoa, I didn't know I was marrying this." Okay, now I got a kid, and so I'm like, okay. So before you judge me, I'm not talking about cuss words. I'm talking about words that rhyme with boron and Cupid and Phillies and that kind of stuff. So that's an area of my walk where I don't reflect Christ. It just is, and it seems kind of silly, kind of trivial. But think about it. Think about it. We're going to get to this in a second. What I say is just a surface. Like, if that's what comes out of my mouth in traffic, like, what do you think is going to happen when something serious takes place? Like, so that's an area where I've got to constantly be watching myself and constantly be asking, are the people in my car, even if they're my wife and my kid, whom God has entrusted to me to disciple, like, are they seeing anything that reflects Christ in that? Now, versus maybe next year, is there any difference? So your actions will demonstrate the character of God. Here's the second thing that happens when you really get the gospel and when the knowledge and the wisdom and the will of God become realities in your life. Your affections, not just your actions, but your affections will continually deepen for God through the work of God. Okay, so I want to make 2-3 points here. Here's the first one. It's hard. I mean, it's just, if it just stopped with actions, we'd all be good. Walking in a manner worthy of the Lord involves way more than just your actions. Right? So follow me this. One of the things that the New Testament puts a premium on, like puts a huge emphasis on, is that your attitudes are just sort of your affections, what you think, how you feel. Those things are far more important than what you do. Okay, why? That sounds sort of, why would that be the case? Because your actions are just the outward manifestation of what's going on in your heart. So when I lose my mind on the interstate, like that's not just, oh, that's kind of funny, or it's just one moment in his life where he's like, that just shows there's something in my heart that needs some changing. Because Jesus is pretty clear. What comes out of your mouth is just a mirror of what's in your heart. And there's no way to get around it. I mean, it's not like you can sort of cover yourself up for a time, because eventually people who are closest to you are going to know what's in your heart by what you do and what you say. Okay, so if you don't believe me, let me just read for you from Matthew chapter 5. Turn with me to Matthew 5 if you got it. If you don't, just listen. This is from Jesus himself. So this is not Patrick, because he would never say this. He would want to just be actions. This is Jesus. In chapter 5, Matthew, verse 21, Sermon on the Mount. You know this, but I just want you to hear it again. Jesus is giving this whole thing about, blessed are you, you're salt and light, Christ, I've come to fulfill the law. And then he goes into something hard that nobody wants to hear. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to those of old, in other words, before I got here, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. Okay, here's the word that's just awful. Verse 22, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Okay, why? Why would it be that if I'm angry, or I insult, or I say something, that I'm just as worthy of hell as the person who kills his brother? So what Jesus did is he just amped things up like by 1,000. Because before it was just what you do. Like murder is something that you do. Like you do that to someone. But if I'm angry, I'm not doing anything to anybody. I'm just being angry. But what Jesus has done is he said, actions, not just actions, hello, like what you feel, like your affections, your emotions, your attitudes. Keep going. Verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, outward, doing. But I say to you, verse 28, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her, where? In his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Verse 31. It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him get her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. There's verse 33, verse 38, verse 43. So he keeps going on, different sections. Oaths, retaliation, love. Here's his whole point. Before Christ came, there was a time when actions were good enough. Like, you just do these certain things, the Jewish law, do these certain things, and you're going to be good. But what Jesus just did is just sort of flipped the whole grid, and he said, okay, what's more important than anything else are your affections, are your attitudes. Because they determine what you do. So, no, you don't have to cut someone's throat. You're going to be, it's the same. In some ways, it's worse that you are angry with them than if you actually murdered them. And that seems like, what in the world? Anger is just some sort of thing, like murder is a big deal. Anger is just sort of whatever. When Jesus said, no. Like, anger is far more important to me than murder, because anger has to do with your affections, where your heart is. And that's what Jesus is going after. So Paul is sort of saying the same thing in chapter 1. What he's saying is, when you really get a hold of God's will, and when it really starts to take root in your life, your actions will change. But why? Because you clean yourself up? You start doing some stuff better than you did before? Like no. Like he's saying, your actions change because your affections change. Like your attitudes change. The Spirit comes in and does the work in you. Okay, so here's my point. Outward demonstration is not inward transformation. Like looking godly is not being godly. And I see this every Sunday morning. I've been in church for a long time. You have too. You know what I'm talking about. But you walk up to somebody And you know, like you heard in the past week they've had a rough week. Okay, so you're expecting them to say it's been a rough week. This happened. This happened.